Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, is one of the most memorable pieces of literature from the Great Awakening period. According to Douglas Winiarski's article, we need to understand this sermon in the context that it originally appeared in, which is in revivalism. This sermon has been heavily analyzed by numerous people for its imagery, skillful use of repetition, contrast of terror and hope, its immediacy, its personal tone, its escalating emotional appeal, its pulsating rhythm, and other elements. But Winiarski's argument connects the local history of radical revivalism in the Enfield area with Edwards' intellectual and theological development. He argues that in order to understand the sermon, we need to suspend Edwards' widely accepted reputation as America's greatest theologian and to peel back the layers of myth and legend that surround him. He argues that even though Edwards is known for his moderation and emphasis on reason and discernment, this view had evolved, and that initially Edwards was a supporter of some of the most radical practices of the revival movement. These were things that Edwards would later himself have to combat, as is demonstrated in his 1749 expulsion from his pulpit. The other article covering Edwards' sermon was written by Edwin H. Cady. He describes the sermon more as a genuine work of literary art. He sees Edwards as a mystic who is profoundly convinced of the reality of his subjective experience of God, who is trying to find a means to drive his own experience into the minds of his audience. Edwards' job, according to Cady, was to find some way to move a callous audience who had long ago been desensitized to standard methods of preaching, and who had up to this point resisted the tendencies seen in other cities in the revival movement. To accomplish his goals, Edwards had to try to throw all of his imaginative and literary resources into the creation of a metaphysical tour de force, which would provide a profound conceptual and emotional experience for his audience. Cady believes that Edwards accomplishes this goal, mainly through using metaphorical images drawn from biblical quotation, but also through careful artistic elaboration of the symbols of his own imagination. Surprisingly, according to Cady, the fire imagery in the sermon amounts to little more than a quarter of the total figure of his words, and pictures of hellfire appear to be neither its most vivid nor its most numerous images. In fact, he says that this sermon is not really directly concerned with creating hell imaginatively at all. For instance, he mentions that there's no specific words describing the intensity of the flames or the color or the heat. Rather, Cady says the primary images used are tension and pressure symbols of God's wrath and the suspension heaviness symbols, as he calls them. The tension pressure images include those of a threatening sword, the storm, the flood, the bow, the winepress, the grape treading. But the main focus, according to Cady, is on how dreadfully the sinner dangles just before he plunges into eternal agony, on the sense of eerie suspension upon almost nothing, on the sinner's treacherous footing and dangerous weight as he walks in slippery places and walks over the pit of hell on a rotten covering.